Theology reading group started, I think like 13 or 14 years ago. One of the profs at the university he's Jewish, he's an atheist, he's a philosopher, very interested in theology, particularly the problem of suffering. He and his then wife, who was an Anglican and did theology, and I and another couple of faculty members got together to read a book of theology together. And that just sort of spawned the theology reading group. And so he and I have continued it. We're the two sustaining members of it, and people have come and left, and students have come while they're students. Some have stayed involved. Some people from the community have heard of it and have come. We meet twice a month at his house now. We've met at different places over the years. We choose a book of theology that has some interest. Basically, I choose books that interest me and hope that they interest the group. And sometimes they don't. I mean, sometimes people will drop out because the book doesn't have particular appeal. Sometimes a particular book will draw people for that term. And we do a book a term. So we end up about 6 sessions, I think. And then we have sort of a potluck at the end and watch a movie together. And then the next term, we start another reading, another book. And we've done all sorts of things, almost entirely Christian theology or biblical studies. We have done a number of books written by Jewish scholars. We've done a couple that are out of that pale. We did one sociology book, but I got way too much razzing from the philosopher about, that lightweight sociology, so we haven't repeated that experiment. Next term, though, we're reading a book by a Marxist literary critic who is defending the Christian tradition from Dawkins and Hitchens. So I'm really excited about what next term is going to bring. Part of what I love about the reading group, though, is that the questions are all there. Like the questions, you're expected to be respectful. I mean, we try not to call each other names, although Paul has called me stupid on a few occasions. But generally speaking, we try, that's because I know he loves me, it's okay. But we try to be respectful of each other and try to take people's questions seriously. But there's really no rules about what you're allowed to ask. You don't have to be a believer. Many people who come aren't, or who were, but they've lost their faith, or they're seekers, they're interested. But what we hear a lot is that people find they can't ever do this in church. There's no venue, and there's often no openness. So we'll have people come. We did one term on religion and sexuality, for instance, and we had people come just that term because he said this is something they desperately wanted to talk about, but no church was willing to be open to questions or comments that were sort of outside whatever that church's pale was, whatever. And that it came from a variety of sources. I mean, some from people who had gone to liberal churches, some had gone to conservative. So it wasn't like it was just, this particular church is a pain because you can't talk about this. It was just churches generally. What I hear often is that churches generally don't have a culture that encourages those kinds of questions. And often people said they're clergy, they'll go to ministers thinking, here's somebody this is their job, I can ask them questions. And they said, I've had a number of students say it's like they're really insecure. And the clergy get afraid. It's like, they'll say something that makes Jesus look bad, or they won't be able to answer the questions, or they just don't know how to say, you know what, I don't know. And so they'll often bring out sort of canned answer. Well, if you just read the Bible, you'll find your answers. Or often trite answers to problems of suffering, particularly around the problem of suffering, where people just come away saying, that's just not a helpful answer. And so theology reading group just becomes a real community of people who want to ask those kinds of questions. But other than saying grace at our potlucks, there's nothing explicitly sort of religious. I mean, there's no worship element to it. And that's intentional because it's really meant to just be a place where people come and talk about these things. But a friend and I were talking about how we'd love to see a place where in worship there was that same openness to asking those kinds of questions. So we decided we'd offer an alternative service in a place that was sort of neutral ground. So we went to the owner of a coffee house in town, and we asked her if she would let us use her place, because it's not open in the evenings. Could we use it for what we called UnChurch? Same great taste, just less structure, rules, expectations maybe. So she said sure, and she gave us coffee and sort of left us what baking was done at the end of the day, and we would gather there for it was a very simple liturgy. My friend is a Lutheran pastor, Rebecca Eckert, and she is a wonderful musician, so she would play guitar, and we would choose music that was easy to sing, accessible, things, some of the Lutheran Marty Haugen kind of music, or some of the stuff out of the Songs for Gospel People, the United Church book. Just easy things for people to enter into, even if they didn't have real church background. You didn't need a lot of sort of church experience. Very simple liturgy with a reading, and we followed through a book or through a theme with fairly significant sections of scripture, like fairly long readings, and sometimes reading more than once. We sort of experimented with using the bell and doing that kind of slow reading, repetitive reading. We did a little bit of that. We tried a number of different things actually, and some things seemed to work and some things didn't seem to work as well. We sat in a circle around the table, so there was sort of no sort of head of the church, no sort of leadership in that sort of traditional front and center kind of way. And Becky and I tried to sort of sit so we weren't the head of the table, and we encouraged that sort of almost a circle. I mean, sometimes if we were more people, it was a rectangle, but that shape anyway. And we would sing a little, and there'd be an opening prayer, and then we would read scripture, and then one of us would preach. And the idea of the sermon would be, it wasn't your sort of standard sermon, because it was more of a teaching talk, trying to really wrestle with some of the difficulties of the text. So we chose texts quite intentionally that were not straightforward, or that pose real dilemmas for us. Like one evening we did the sacrifice of Isaac, and sort of why Jews and Christians have really struggled with God's command to kill his son, and how they've made sense of it, what they've done with it, how it's been interpreted, how Jews have interpreted it differently than Christians, and then sort of we would open things up for discussion. So we would preach for about 20 minutes, actually a fairly significant sermon, but then would just sort of open it up for conversation. And that's where we were really trying to depart from the typical church service and allow people to raise the kinds of questions that they had. And what we found was that people just, didn't want to stop talking. This time would just grow. We'd end up spending an hour